really excited for this fireside chat because it brings together alumni from Harvard Business School who've entered the worker ownership ecosystem. And so we're really excited to explore with them how were they prepared, why among all of their peers at Harvard Business School did they take the pathway that they did, and how can we, as those of you who are scholars in educational institutions, how can we prepare more leaders for the worker ownership ecosystem? So with that, I'm excited to introduce Ethan Rouen. Ethan is the Terry F. and Bradley M. Bloom Associate Professor of Business Administration in the Accounting and Management Unit here at Harvard Business School. His research focuses on the measurement, disclosure, and management of human capital, with a particular interest in improving engagement and of outcomes for low-wage workers. With that, I turn it over to Ethan Rouen.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony. So first, with the bad news, because of the political uncertainty, our pyrotechnics budget's been cut, so the fireside chat is clearly missing something important. So we're gonna have a chalkboard chat instead. I will let our three panelists introduce themselves, but I want to start by just acknowledging that I have personal connections with all three of them and have worked in this space in very different ways, and they've shaped my thinking in very different ways. So Anne was one of the original members of the Aspen Institute Economic Mobility Fellowship, which I helped to create. Bobby has been so generous in allowing me to study and examine the firm that he ran that was employee-owned. And Courtney was my student in a course called Reimagining Capitalism, where I try to indoctrinate students into this topic. So I'll start by just having each of them introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got into the employee ownership space. So go for it.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Ethan mentioned, I was a student of his last year, so I'm a very recent alum. And last year, I was in a business school, and I was sitting in his classroom called Reimagining Capitalism, and I was one of those students that was indoctrinated. So my business school plan or post-business school plan was to go into consulting. I had an offer to move to DC, and that was the plan. I then took the course, and Ethan had written a case on KKR and employee ownership, and I was very interested immediately. And so I started reaching out to several people in the room, actually. Some of your names are familiar, and people who were working in the space, and just started doing informational coffee chats, trying to learn a bit more about job opportunities in the space. It's a fairly small but friendly industry, and so I spoke with several people, and what ultimately became of that is I reached out to a firm called ButcherJoseph, and it's a middle market investment bank. And we work with all types of clients, but specifically founders who are looking to sell their businesses. And so we do traditional M&A work in that we will sell to private equity or we'll sell to a strategic competitor, but we also specialize in our area of expertise is in employee stock ownership plans. And so about 1/3 to 50% of our deals will be sales to ESOPs. And that's the work that got me excited and interested in ButcherJoseph. So that's what we do. We are based in St. Louis. We're headquartered in St. Louis. We do work with founders often that are family-led businesses, so second or third generation. Given our geography and given our clientele, we often serve clients in what we refer to as the old economy, so a lot of industrials and manufacturing or transportation type businesses. And those businesses are often great candidates for a sale to ESOP. So that is the type of work that I've been doing for the past 8 months since I left the business school.
Terrific. Bobby Lane, it's a pleasure to be here. My interest in this space originated from a lifetime of actually working on the front lines. I'm 5th generation construction services. We provide mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection services to non-residential structures, universities, renewable energy facilities, data centers, large-scale industrial projects. Grew up on a job site, started working in the field as a teenager. The organization I grew up in, which my father still runs, Comfort Systems, is the 2nd largest MEPS contractor in North America with about 25,000 employees. We have a firm family philosophy of being field first. It's our entire ethos, and it's how we've survived for 100 years of having that focus on what's in the best interest of our employees in a very tight generational shortage labor market here in the United States, and especially trades. every single manager in our organization started in the field. I started off on cleanup crew, worked all your way up to project management. So it gives you that philosophy of not only operational knowledge of a job, but a employee-focused culture. I mean, you need to take an appreciation that every single morning, 25,000 folks lace up Red Wing boots, put on a hard hat, and hang pipe. And they do that day in and day out for 40 years. There's great nobility in that. You got to respect it. And when I returned prior to coming to HBS, I was a senior executive at Comfort Systems. And my interest was, in 1997, we sought to do a broad-based employee ownership program, but were deterred by an activist hedge fund. That was the time we went public. 2016, I sought to implement a similar program, again, deterred by an activist hedge fund who didn't see the merits of what we were seeking to accomplish. As such, after school, I founded a union fire and life safety business. We grew into one of the largest operators in North America in under 3 years with hundreds of employees. We had received, in a little under 3 years, we received an offer from the largest publicly traded company in the space, API Group, for well over $100 million. The result of which was one of the highest returns in the history of the U.S. building industry at a 13.5x MOIC and a 238% IRR. This could not have been accomplished without the broad-based equity plan that was put into place, and the result was tens of millions to frontline employees in a relatively short period of time. That business was sold. I'm now launching another venture, Union Electrical Services, hoping to mirror what I did at Endeavor, just on a much larger scale.
Amazing. Hi, Ann Arlinghaus. I'm a partner at KKR, which is a global asset management firm. I have to say that now because we have businesses outside of private equity, but our roots are really in the private equity industry. We've been around for about 50 years. I've worked at KKR for the last 15 years, and I lead our team called KKR Capstone, which is our portfolio value creation team. So our job is to work with our investment teams and the management teams of the businesses that we invest in to help them drive value creation. And my kind of story in terms of this work is really kind of following the leadership of Pete Stavros, who is one of our global co-heads of private equity and an enormous champion of broad-based ownership. Under his leadership about a decade or so ago, we started to create broad-based ownership programs in our industrials companies in America's private equity. And these programs proved to be incredibly successful, not only in terms of driving change for the workers who participated in them, but also really creating incredible outcomes for our investors. And so that idea of broad-based ownership has really become, frankly, the core strategy of how KKR thinks about investing in companies and creating value. So about 4 years ago, we made a commitment that we were going to invest in broad-based ownership programs across everything we do. And so it went from something that was sort of incubated in one industry vertical, and you would maybe launch one program every year, every other year, to in the last 4 years, we've launched over 50 programs globally across private equity. We have examples in our real estate business, credit, and a number in infrastructure all across the globe. And so my team and I have really taken a role in terms of how do we make this come alive and do this at scale. And I think what we have learned keenly is that it's one thing to sort of say, okay, everybody's an owner, you've got a participation in the company, let's go. We can figure out how to do the math of that. We've got a lot of people across our firm who are great at math and doing the modeling around incentive programs. What has proven to be both harder and I think so exciting is how do you really create a culture of ownership in programs? Evan used that term earlier today. And so, my team and I are really creating a playbook and a model around how do you drive the worker voice, the participation, the transparency and information sharing that's required to really make this concept come to life and drive ultimately value creation.
Well, I should say, I feel like it's my birthday because not only do I get to ask you all a bunch of questions that we never seem to have time to ask when we're meeting, but we get to do it in front of people who really did a lot of effort in building this field. So I'm going to ask them a couple of questions. The focus here is really thinking about, we have a lot of educators in the room. how do we as educators make this more salient, make this more attainable to our students as the interest grows? And then I will try not to hog up too much of the airspace. I'll turn it over to you all for questions as well. But let's start by talking about the challenges. Courtney, let's start with you again. What are, I know you're early in your career here, what are two of the biggest challenges you and ButcherJoseph face right now in implementing employee ownership?
A couple of the biggest challenges that we face in implementing employee ownership, and I'm sure this will resonate with many in the room. The first one I would think is education. And so ESOPs are sort of a black box. And what we're finding is that not just the founders and our clients that we work with, but there are many stakeholders in the ecosystem that are unaware of what types of businesses would be good candidates for a sale to an ESOP. So for example, many of our clients work with trusted advisors and have had those relationships for decades. And when it comes time to sell their businesses, those financial advisors haven't heard of an ESOP or aren't aware of what ESOPs are. And so they're not recommending that as a potential transaction for the founder or as potential for succession planning. And so there is a huge part of our role, which is educating the stakeholders involved. I would say the other very big challenge that we face is access to capital. And so at the time of the transaction closes, it is a very levered vehicle. And so the company will take on debt to buy out the founder. And so there are very few lenders. We work with several of them, but there are a few lenders that specialize in ESOPs and who really understand the mechanics of an ESOP. And so that is another challenge that we face is access to capital to close transactions like this.
Now, Bobby came to my class last year, and we spent about 80 minutes talking about all the challenges, and we could have probably spent another 160 minutes. But yeah, why don't you highlight some of those challenges?
First and foremost, I mean, I'm unequivocally pro-union. I believe that the union workforce can be a really powerful vehicle creating significant equity returns. But one thing I didn't appreciate, the first labor union in the United States was around 1794. We've had 230 years of labor relations in this country that have been contentious. And at least in the building trades, I would argue part of the signatory companies haven't acted in good faith with labor. Incentive programs have been designed to diminish the power of the union, diminish the power of labor, in an effort to ultimately deunionize that labor force, which has happened at a pretty rapid pace since the Reagan administration. I don't find it to be right, and hence one of the reasons that I did what I did. But what I didn't fully appreciate was if you come even in with noble intent, you're battling against 230 years of labor history. And when we developed this broad-based equity program, I did not fully understand the response of the various labor unions when we had over a dozen labor partners as part of this program. Part of the challenges that I would face is they didn't want to be called equity because that was the first step in deunionization, historically deployed by signatory companies. They didn't like that they hadn't won it in a battle, in a labor negotiation. It was a free gift that I had provided them, and they thought, what's the catch? And quite frankly, I was looking at the world at the way I wanted it to look like, not what the reality on the ground was. And as such, I needed to spend more upfront work with these various unions, specifically the local unions in Chicago, which was fun. But great group, just battle hardened. But effectively to implement this program. And the next time, and this is an IDEW next platform, and we've really laid the groundwork of how to be partners with the union and what we're trying to accomplish. The second primary challenge here is, when you're dealing with a working class cohort, not maybe a technology company with sophisticated, these kids went to Stanford or Harvard or wherever people get programmers, that's not my world. There can be a barrier to financial literacy and what these complex programs mean for a frontline employee. And in our system, in Comfort, we invest tens of millions of dollars in employee education, whether it's financial literacy, teaching basic English, writing, English as a second language skill set in complex programs might look great on a Blackboard or a PowerPoint or an Excel, but how to equate that into a tangible message to create change with an audience that, and I'm not going to criticize the U.S. public education system too bad here, but it's not a cohort that usually asks questions, especially in a group setting. So you really have to lay the groundwork. It's not enough just to present the program. You have to have an entire educational program for the audience to know what it means and feel comfortable with it.
Yeah, I'll pick up actually on both of those themes from my angle as well. I think first and foremost, one of the biggest challenges is really developing trust amongst employees and management in a company. And so whether it's a unionized labor force or not, and I've seen it very much across industries, right? Our program started in industrial companies, but now we have financial services companies, a number of our tech investments, consumer retail, really all across the gamut, where the kind of key element of really unlocking value in these programs for the workforce is to create an environment where there's real trust between what your C-suite is saying and what kind of the frontline worker believes and feels empowered to do. And so we have started to see a correlation between leaders who have a high degree of empathy and their ability to really create that trust. And that's a big area that we've been focusing on to both identify leaders of our portfolio companies, but also to create programs to help leaders build empathy and understanding of kind of what the broad base of workers is experiencing. And I think that relates very much to the idea around how do you engage people in an ownership culture. You have to have the skills and the resources to be an owner. We talk a lot about thinking, acting, feeling like an owner. And in order to do that, you have to have the financial literacy to understand how equity value in the business is created. We have our CFOs across our portfolio companies. We ask them to essentially teach a basic LBO modeling course effectively to the broad base of their employees, put in the language of their business, in the language of their industry, in kind of concepts that people can resonate with. But it's incredibly important because how in the world is somebody supposed to feel and act like an owner if they don't really understand their role in the business and how their role generates equity value? So we've invested a lot in programming, both to do that kind of corporate finance education and also personal finance, because I'll get the stats wrong, but something like 3/4 of Americans can't withstand a $400 emergency. And when you're living in that kind of reality, when a firm comes in and says, look, we're all owners in this business together, our average hold period for an investment is 5 years. And so at that point in time, there'll be a monetization event that everybody's going to participate in alongside the investors. It's like, okay, 5 years from now, that might as well not be real or something I don't care about. And so I think enabling people to get control over their sort of personal financial lives. And so we've started to invest in financial literacy and resiliency programming from day one when we invest in a business. Historically, we said when there are payouts, we'll help you with your taxes and we'll think about financial coaching then. We start it now upfront when we launch the program. And so it enables just a different conversation along the journey.
That's great. And you now, all three of you have talked a little bit. I mean, the challenges really revolve around educating the stakeholders involved in this. At the risk of asking you to do my job, how do you think about that? What do you wish you had had, or what do you think is missing or is necessary for general business education to get people to get future leaders involved in this, implementing this in an effective way?
I mean, from my experience at the business school, we did have several leaders in constantly. We had different CEOs, different executive teams in every week, and they were speaking about the experience that they had running their businesses. And what I found is quite often you could pull out common themes or common trends in what they were sharing. And often there were gripes about ownership, and whether that was public ownership and reporting to external shareholders, or whether that was private equity backing and having differing views with your new ownership team. And so there was this theme, but often what I found is that was never really explored at the business school. So we never, I mean, in your class we talked about innovating on ownership models, And I found that to be very powerful, the discussions that we were having there. And so I think that needs to be maybe explored a little bit more. And in some of the classes, we were starting to see it. And employee ownership was being woven into a couple of my classes in my second year of business school. And I think that is a very important discussion to be had, rather than just accepting sort of the status quo ownership models that we are used to. Is there room for employee ownership, and what does that look like? And does it make sense that employees should be sharing in the wealth that they contribute and in the wealth that they help the business create? Those are conversations that I think are important to have. And from my perspective, they were starting to happen in my second year of business school.
I'm exceptionally grateful to have been given the privilege to attend this university. It dramatically changed my life, and it helped me really be able to talk to people in a capital provider situation, or maybe with a consultant. And it's such a special place that you really invest your whole self in here. Now, I candidly, my whole life grew up in the field. I feel more comfortable in the field, quite frankly, with the trades. And I kind of lost a little bit about my way to communicate in a field perspective coming through this institution. I think there can be communication programming on how to deliver messages to a broader audience of people than necessarily a McKinsey consultant. And I'm not being critical of McKinsey. It's just 1, 2, 3. There's like a relatability, and with that comes through experience, bringing those types of leaders that run those organizations here to. Not everyone has a Ferrari problem. When you're looking at GE and you're trying to, determine what's the best way to allocate capital. Most businesses, especially in the lower middle market, this is a street fight. And you got to know, it's all great saying, oh, let's really work on corporate finance. I have a problem where my controller just leaves and no one knows how to run a balance sheet. There's just a different exposure set. The second is I could probably count maybe 1 or 2 classes that had to do with a unionized labor force, which makes up a large company set here in North America, and especially in Europe. I had more classes just dedicated to Bill Ackerman than I had on unions. And that's not an exaggeration, and that's nothing against Bill Ackerman, but it creates its own unique challenges. Dealing with the unionized labor force, it can be a great partner. I'd love for somebody to come to this school and say, excellent labor, terrific culture, great culture and embodiment of like identity associated with the unions, which would be pretty exciting, and to explore their models. I mean, not that there's a US-centric approach here, but other countries have taken a different approach, and it's really worked out. Germany, for example, has a policy of co-determination, where a member of labor typically serves on a board and makes advisory decisions. I would have loved to see a case and explore that. I think there's a great opportunity there. Or Mr. Edwards, sir, one of your cases would have been great to hear about it in class. But I don't think those opportunities were as fruitful as some others.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be helpful to have more content on the interplay and distinctions between compensation and ownership and equity ownership. You know, one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about is how important it is that ownership programs are completely incremental to the compensation that you have in your day-to-day. And I think and also who's bearing risk between the kind of worker and investors or other sources of capital. I think there's a really interesting sort of spectrum if you think about tech companies, where a lot of really early stage tech companies are giving a lot of ownership to employees, but it's really in lieu of other forms of competitive compensation, all the way to some of the programs that that we're talking about here. I think just having more underpinnings of how to think about compensation philosophy and to think about it in the context of ownership would be really helpful and impactful. And I'd sort of thinking about retirement and retirement benefits. This country has undergone a huge shift from a defined benefit sort of system to one in which people need to take personal ownership and accountability for their financial security over the long run. And I don't think that at least I came out of HBS thinking about the ramifications of that, and I think about that a lot now in terms of the work that I'm doing. And then picking up, I think, on this theme of leadership, it was funny because one of the the class that my RC year and I joked about the most was LEAD,
You should explain to the audience.
which is it's a leadership course that essentially every HBS student takes in their first year, and it was probably maybe the most touchy feely of the courses in the first semester, and my section liked to joke about it. But anyways, the class that all of us came back by our 5-year reunion and said really mattered was the one that really stuck with us was LEAD, because all of the no matter what kind of work we've been doing, the ability to connect with people, to understand how to interact with people, to influence, whether that's influencing, other providers of capital to be thinking about ownership programs, or importantly, how do you really connect with people and explain things in ways that everybody can understand and just use really simple language. I think that there's probably more room for that in the business education than maybe we had.
As an accounting professor, I'll pretend you didn't just really hurt my feelings. Let me ask you each a question. I imagine that if we brought all of the first year Harvard Business School students here, a third would want to be Courtney, a third would want to be Bobby, and a third would want to be Ann. You hit them all. We have private equity, we have entrepreneurship through acquisition, we have not just investment banking, but investment banking because you didn't want to do consulting. The dream jobs of every HBS. So let me start with you, Ann. You started on a fairly traditional PE route. Can you talk a little bit about how you transitioned into this ownership space and the skills that you needed to acquire?
Yeah, I really, so I worked for KKR before I came to business school, and I went back to working with KKR. So I have no imagination in my career really. And it was really, sort of through KKR really deciding to invest at scale in this idea of broad-based ownership that I became really involved with this. But the reason that I stepped into that role to help lead kind of our operationalization of it was because talent has been a huge theme of the work that I've done from an operations perspective. So the kind of the formative investments that I worked on in my career were all situations where having leadership at the top and real communication and understanding of the direction in which the business was headed, and the ability to, whether we called it broad-based ownership or deep equity plans, the ability to use incentive structures to rally the whole organization around a common vision and get people kind of all rowing in the same direction was sort of a theme in a lot of the investments that I had worked on that were successful. And I started to think about, we spend a lot of time assessing C-suite talent in terms of the managers that work at our companies. What if we spent the same amount of time really thinking about the broad base of employees, and how do we unlock, sort of the potential of human capital across a whole organization? And so a lot of the work around broad-based ownership really aligns with work that I had been doing around thinking about people issues with the same mindset and rigor that you think about other operational issues. So measuring outcomes for your human capital, having dashboards and scorecards, talking about it at the board level in terms of what's the engagement of your workforce. And I think for me, a lot of the skills that I was developing along the way have really translated well into this world of trying to think about, how am I communicating across an organization? I think a broad-based ownership plan is the best accelerant you could possibly have for any kind of change initiative in an organization, because it's a way to, build trust, to sort of put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, to say we all, kind of go on this journey together. We're all going to share in the rewards. And so for me, it's been a pretty natural evolution and an amazing opportunity, frankly, to get to tap into a lot of the things that I spent time thinking about when I was at HBS. I was in the social enterprise clubs, and I did a bunch of really interesting sort of independent studies with professors around organizations that were in this kind of social enterprise space. And so it's been a really amazing way to kind of think about a bigger impact than just sort of the four walls of KKR.
Bobby, you've done, I feel like there's this growing group of students who are really interested in entrepreneurship through acquisition, the idea of finding a company to buy to become a CEO, and you did something similar. And within this group, there's a not insignificant subset of students who are interested in this because, in part, of the potential for employee ownership. I'm wondering what you see as missing from leadership curriculum broadly to encourage this, to help students hit the ground running, knowing that you hit the ground running and we're running on a treadmill that was gradually speeding up.
Well, it's a great question, and since the sale of Endeavor, word has gotten out in the HBS community, and I probably have 2 or 3 conversations with current students or post students that fell into a different path and want to reevaluate. A lot of McKinsey consultants. I'm not kidding, right? This isn't sponsored by McKinsey. But,
the only other job I've ever had was working.
There we go. Yeah. But yeah, it's really interesting because as I discuss what this is, and there's a couple of misconceptions. There was a really interesting question in the first session asking, is there a disproportionate risk having equity tied into the business of, instead of broad-based portfolio diversification? It's a great question. And I tell each of these individuals that every day that I wake up in pure fear. And every day that I go to sleep, I work in tremendous regret that I didn't do enough for my people. Because each person I'm responsible for, not only my employees, but they might have 3, 4, 5 members. And this is the working population that I work with. This might be their only source of income. And this is a cohort that might have food insecurity, affordable housing challenges. Like, you have to completely be all in. And so if you don't really love the people and are willing to make any sacrifice necessary to support them in their dreams to become better people, you shouldn't get in this line of work. My life would have been exponentially easier if I just returned to Comfort Systems, become the COO, replace my father as CEO, but it didn't fulfill the primary problem that I was trying to solve for this one life that we're all gifted to have. And I would encourage HBS that classes such as LEAD, that I couldn't agree more, were quite transformative for me of what's your authentic leadership style? Why are you doing what you're doing? Many of us get on this hamster wheel of life. Everybody in this room at some point made a decision to sacrifice for an objective. It would have been easier to get a B in a class instead of staying all night to get an A. It would have been easier not to pursue your dreams and go into investment banking or do something different in life. We all make these sacrifices. But I feel instead of you do all this effort, all this work to accomplish a goal, you don't reflect on the goal. You just keep going on this hamster wheel of the next goal, the next goal, the next goal. And when real people's lives are in the balance of this decision, you have to weigh it with a certain degree of seriousness. So is this a cohort of the population you really want to deal with? It's not what, talk with a whole bunch of people from private equity. This isn't what they think it is. Managing a spreadsheet and managing people are completely different, especially in organizations this small. And so I would really encourage the program to, I love the fact that HBS forced us into a couple different, our first year, we have a set curriculum in our first semester and our second semester. There were classes that I never would have taken if I had been just given at my own discretion to just take construction management courses. But it helps you develop a little bit of a rounded skill set, and similar to the morality question of leadership, I think is really important of why you're doing what you're doing. And I strongly encourage all of your schools to demand, I don't want to sound like that, to strongly encourage your student population to find out who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, that was, and so Courtney, we're also going in reverse order of graduation here. So Courtney, you are the most recent graduate as well. And it should be clear that it wasn't that you were in the middle of your first summer and you realized consulting wasn't for you. You were in your second year and had an offer that you had agreed to, and then realized you wanted to do something different. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the support you received from the institution that is Harvard Business School, as well as the support that you didn't receive that you wish you had had in making that fairly dramatic transition?
Sure, and it was a fairly dramatic transition for me. So the path to that, what led to that was I did an internship. I did my consulting internship, and I had signed an offer to go back. During my internship, I was on an engagement, a restructuring engagement. And so we were structuring mass layoffs. And I came back thinking, that's not really what I want to be doing. I didn't find it to be meaningful work or enjoyable work. And there were a few things that happened in my second year of business school, thankfully, which led to my ultimate decisions to change paths. And so one of those was taking part in your course and reading the case on KKR and the work that they were doing in employee ownership, and me thinking, this is really interesting. And this is something I could see myself becoming very passionate about. And thankfully, at the exact same time, my firm reached out and said, we're going to push your start date back 8 months. We don't have enough client work right now, and so things are a bit slow. And what that gave me the opportunity to do was look for and start seeking an internship in a space that I was very excited about, and reaching out to many others who are excited about this space as well. And ultimately, taking a full-time job offer and transitioning to this full-time. So that's what led to my decision. I am very, very grateful for the faculty at the business school, who I found to be tremendously supportive throughout that time. I think professors have a huge impact on the decisions that students make in terms of their careers, the choices that they make, and the jobs that they select. And many of the professors at the business school make themselves available in office hours for coffee chats to talk about things completely unrelated to the courses that they're teaching. And that advice is invaluable. So is the networks that they open up to students. So I did reach out to you and I told you this was a space I wanted to learn more about. And you did put me in touch with several people who were working in this space. And so those conversations are incredibly valuable. And I'm very grateful for that. The second part of your question was, what do I wish there was more of to make that transition? I would say something like the career services tend to be focused, and I promise we're not here to make fun of consultants, but tend to be focused on the traditional paths out of an MBA, which are private equity, consulting, investment banking. But when you're looking at something a little bit more niche, there are not as many resources available. And so I think having conversations with professors is what I fell back on, but I would have valued some additional support from a career services center.
Let's see why I asked Courtney to be on the panel. Thanks. I'm blushing. I'm having to open up to questions from the audience. Yeah, go ahead. All right.
Thanks. I wanted to go back to a comment I think, Anne, you made about trust as kind of an impediment to moving to employee ownership, and I just wanted to hear a bit more. One way of thinking about it is, from the outside, you might think that the lack of trust between managers and employees would move in the opposite direction, because employees don't trust management. They want to take more of the company for themselves, but instead it seems to be pushing in the other direction. And so I wonder, why is that exactly? Is it the worries about risk? Like, what kind of risk are we taking on? Is there something they're not telling us about the risk we're taking on and doing that? And then if so, you also talked about financial literacy. And then I wonder, is that just kind of independently what needs to be addressed separately from the trust issue, where if employees just were confident they knew what they were getting into, regardless of trust issues with management, maybe that would be enough. And maybe a part of why I'm wondering that is just trust issues in organizations, especially small ones, can have long histories, be very slow to solve. And so we had to solve the trust issues before we could move to employee ownership. That might seem prohibitive in some cases. So anyway, I know Amy brought this up, but I'm curious what you all think about this.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify the comment, what I'm saying is, in order to really create an ownership culture, I think you have to create more trust in the organization. And I do think that the financial literacy angle to it is interrelated, in that a lot of times the reason that somebody isn't valuing an ownership program from an employee's perspective is that they just don't believe that it's real, or they don't believe that it's going to actually result in something that's good for them. We've spent a lot of time, kind of trying to move past this because we don't think that it should be an impediment to creating broad-based ownership programs. So, all of our programs are material, and that we size them so that if, in a base case return, employees are making 6+ months of salary, and we typically try to size between 9 to 12 months. So like a meaningful stake from an economic perspective, and always incremental to existing wages and benefits. And so we do that because we think that it's really important to make sure that, one, we're not asking the people who are kind of in the least advantaged position to take on risk are taking on any additional risk to their kind of livelihoods, but also because of exactly this. Like, we want to be able to say there's no way in which you're going to lose money. Like, it's not possible, because even if the company doesn't perform in the way that we hope that it will, you're no worse off. We're not, kind of making an exchange. So that's the kind of idea behind it.
I can jump in for a moment. From a trust perspective, I think it's being on the front lines. It's hard to understand that this country is almost becoming a nation of mercenaries, each one by themselves without a sense of community, belonging. You look at a lot of our society emphasizes what's different about each and every one of us, but everybody in this room, when you look at it, there's not that many difference. We all want the same things. And I'm not talking about food or shelter or water, but you want to be loved, you want to belong, you want to be valued, you want to be respected. And especially when dealing with the working class, we seem almost at an accelerated rate to create two castes of our society: the educated, like white collar, and the blue collar working class. And so there is this inherent distrust right at the onset because of how society has delineated to oneself. And so, in my opinion, the only way to solve that was, I spent 3 years, 235 days on job sites, on the road, communicating the same message again and again and again. And please understand, this is a population group that is gifted, but they're not necessarily gifted in a way that shows up on a classroom or behind a desk. You have to go to their level. You have to put it in a form of information that they can digest. And if you think you're going to say it once, it's not going to work. You got to say it once, twice, 10 times, 100 times to help them accomplish an objective. And trust is gained slowly and surely. But if anybody thinks this is going to be a light switch, just don't do it, because you'll hurt the broader mission of what we're all trying to accomplish.
Just a follow-up to that, Robert. I really appreciate your comments. Do you see broad-based employee ownership then as being one piece of the potential of kind of like rebuilding that middle ground?
Absolutely.
And just if you could speak to that a little bit.
Absolutely. So similar to Mr. Edwards, when he was talking about putting what was really motivating him about this space, I don't look at broad-based equity ownership from this is great for employee retention or this is great for wealth dispersion. Those are great consequences of the program, but it's creating an identity. It's re-engaging pride and ownership. What you saw in your businesses, these people really invested. They took ownership and pride in what they were doing. And it's the first step to create a collective identity towards accomplishing something great together. When often I found, at least today, everybody's trying to be different or fraction and tribal. It's a great first junction, but then it's only the start. Get everybody on the same team, develop that really robust, proficient culture. And then you start tackling other issues, whatever you think your organization's for me, I believe that we need to have a completely revamped philosophy on childcare in this country. Night and day. I love what the Swedish do when they demand both parents go for 9 months. And I understand that we're all in different organizations, but it's one piece to creating a more collective identity of support system in a private setting. The government's not going to do it. I'm not trying to nationalize everything, but.
And then go ahead, Nate. I had a question for Courtney, and it's specifically because you mentioned career services, and WS does not necessarily provide for you in terms of information. And also the fact that you're at an investment bank that specializes in ESOPs. What is that you have learned since you have been at ButcherJoseph that would have been helpful or instructive for you learning it in business school that would have maybe put you on a trajectory towards working in the employee ownership space? That's a question from the perspective that we all want to foment that more of that interest at the higher ed level so that Eric, Ebert, people like Robert and whatnot, and yourself would want to do this work. So
It's a great question. Thank you. I think what I love about employee ownership is that it touches all aspects of a business. So I think that there is opportunity to weave it into all types of classrooms, especially at an MBA level. So whether we're talking about leadership, very, very relevant, and how to motivate your employees, or whether we're talking about strategy, and there's a ton of research to demonstrate that employee-owned businesses outperform their peers. There's also, it does relate to finance, and specifically like the investment banking or private equity firms that are doing this type of work, or even just looking at a firm that is an ESOP or a company that's an ESOP owned, looking at their balance sheet and looking at the shareholders and trying to understand how that plays into the business. So I do think that there is opportunity to weave broad-based ownership into much of the curriculum at a business school. And it doesn't have to be the focus of the entire case, but it could be a component of the case. And it could come up, especially in a place like the Harvard Business School, where it's all a discussion. It could be a small piece to many different classes. And so I think having more exposure on those types of cases would have been very interesting, at least to me.
thank you.
Gerardo, you've had this.
And this question concerns KKR. I think when KKR started this program, and I have been in this field for a while, the whole field got more attention in terms of the employee ownership, the whole field benefit. And I'm asking this question not as a criticism, just want to know more. What happens, you mentioned there is a holding period, typical holding period of 5 years. After the acquisition, is there a reduction in the workforce? That's number one. And the second question is, what happens after the exit?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we have small n because we only have had a few exits. We've exited about 10 programs thus far, and we've got 55 active programs right now. So we're still very much early in the journey and learning a lot. In general, so there's never been a case where there's a reduction in force at the exit or that we know of, under new ownership. What has typically happened is that the new owners create, particularly if it's a sponsor-to-sponsor transaction where we've sold to another private equity company, the new owners actually create a new ownership program. And the thing is, it works so much better the second time because you've created already the understanding amongst the employee base of what ownership means. The culture has sort of, evolved and has supported that. And people have seen the monetization. So the trust factor we were just talking about becomes less of an issue because people really, have kind of seen real evidence of the payout and what it, what it means to be an owner. So we've had a number of examples where that's happened, where there's a new ownership program with a new sponsor. There are other situations where we sold to a strategic. And so the company comes under that, businesses, compensation programs, and so forth. And I think one of the things that we think is definitely the case in sort of CHI overhead doors, which is the case I think you were referencing. One of the reasons that deal was so successful and that that Ucor, the strategic that bought it, was so excited was because of the culture in the plant, and it was very aligned with sort of the way that they treated people, and they were adopted into their equity programs and so forth. So we really see it as an opportunity for the industry, broadly defined, which is why KKR was a founding member of Ownership Works and why we've invested a lot in the nonprofit there. So Ownership Works is an organization that is really meant to provide consulting services to GPs and in the private equity industry, and then public companies as well, around how to launch ownership programs. And we think that like it's better if everybody is doing this, and it's better for for employees and better for the industry.
May I jump in just real quick, just because that's when you do things right, when you diligently pursue a next partner that is going to embrace the spirit of what you sought to accomplish together. When you're in a situation when you gotten everybody jazzed up, and in my industry, improving your OI margins by 100 bips, 200 bips is considered elite. Broad-based ownership got us over 1,000 bips in under a 2-year period, becoming one of the largest organizations in our space. When you sell to a partner that doesn't believe in your core ethos, when you've got everybody built in, it can be catastrophic. And you will have 450 people that call you almost on a daily basis asking when your RCAs are removed for them to come on over and do whatever you're doing next. So to everybody's credit, if you impose this on a system and then that program doesn't continue, once it can have catastrophic consequences. So if you're in a capital providing position and you want to be go forward stewards on the next partner, like pick somebody, even if it's at a decreased multiple, that's going to continue the mission.
And I will note on the CHI case, the CEO still comes back, and in that case, it really emphasizes the importance of culture, because they were sold to a strategic that didn't have an ownership program, but the culture was so strong. These employees, many of them got walk-away money from the exit, and I think they had 6 people took early retirement in the first year, and the rest of the team is still there. So we have time for one more question.
So I have a question for Robert. I'm very interested in the intersection of unions and employee ownership, and you established a company that is both unionized and employee owned. So can you shed some light on so some people kind of view these two as complementary, some people view it as substitutes. In your experience, what did the union aspect bring to the table that was distinct from the employee ownership aspect? Were there different things that were addressed by these two elements, or were they kind of working jointly and to accomplish the same thing? Or what were some of the distinct things that unions accomplish versus employee ownership in your experience?
It's a great question, and I would also put the caveat that each union, even within a single trade, is very different. So in the trades that we were operating in, there are 17 local unions, historically dominated around tier 1 democratically controlled cities. And then there's a national union which fills in everywhere in between. And the relationships and the dynamics of each one of those unions is very, very different. What the union does do, and what the union has been great at maintaining, even through some challenging government actions in the last 40 years, is it a collective identity of group. When you have people that want to buy into a team, that these are people that have chosen this line of work, it's their identity, it's their brand. You're not starting from scratch as you are potentially with, in my line of work, it's historically union or first generation Americans that might not have that already collective built-in identity. So what I view is the biggest challenge, though, is that because there's been this contentious attitude between both sides for so long, and depending on your business agent that you're dealing with, they feel as if they didn't win it and they didn't beat you up to win it, that they're not doing their jobs and that they will be replaced by their union membership. So when you start giving away free incentives, it's the strangest thing in the world, because you're thinking that they're going to be over the moon, and then you're sitting there and they're calling you everything but a child of God. And you're like, oh, hold up. Like, it's understanding that each union relation needs to be different. You have a built-in collective identity of group, of togetherness that's trying to accomplish an objective, and you can supercharge your growth to, here's a KPI. You've already bought into having one identity. We're going to supercharge that, and we're going to go very hard for 3 years and create something great. But it did. The biggest challenge was that they didn't fight to win the incentive, which is something I really didn't anticipate.
Well, thank you so much for being such great colleagues and teachers to me, and thank you for being here, and thank you all for your thoughtful questions.